You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.
Welcome him. It is a special privilege for me. He is an influential philosopher, writer, and teacher, and he was my teacher in college, and so it is a special privilege for me to have him here and to be able to introduce him. He'll also be addressing the philosophy department tomorrow at 3:30 over in the English and Philosophy building, and you are welcome to come to that at 3:30 tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. at the Wesley Center, just off North Dubuque. He'll have an informal time with students to just come by and discuss, where he'll share a little bit of his own life and experience and sense of vocation and interact with students on that. So we hope that students will come out for that event. Just a few months ago, I was listening to a lecture, and Dr. Wolterstorff was up there with three others of my professors that I'd had at Calvin College, Al Planiga and George Marsden and Rich Mao and Nick Wolterstorff, and they were referred to as the four Beatles of Calvin College. They all kind of came of age in that same time of the 60s with the Beatles and started interacting with each other and with their teaching and their writing, and they've had significant influence. Maybe not quite Beatle-ish, but maybe more importantly, also on the community and on the world. And so we welcome one of the Beatles to be here with us. I was, as I said, his student in the 1970s, and I still remember things out of his aesthetics course, especially one word, and that was the word fittingness. That aesthetics has to do with, does it fit in the right situation, in the right context, and looking at the role of art in society. I also remember the title of his book. I don't remember all the content of it. I did read it. But it was a wonderful title, and I've used it often, playing off from Immanuel Kant, Reason Within the Bounds of Religion. That religion gives a context for our reason, for our intellect, for our studies. Dr. Wolterstorff has made significant contributions to the area of philosophy and Christian perspective on life. He is well known for writings in the philosophy of knowledge and even has reformed epistemology associated with his name. He's well known for his writings in education and very much in the area of educating for shalom, for well-being, for peace, and educating for responsible action, a couple of titles of his books. Also, he's well known for his writings and reflections in the areas of justice that he'll be sharing with us today. He was very influential in developing the perspective and philosophy and education of Calvin College, and then went on to be also a significant contribution at Yale University. He has been a voice to help Christians engage culture and help Christians also hear from the culture around them. And he's also been a hugely important personal voice to many people in his book, Lament for a Son. I've heard many people say that book I've given to many people in tough situations, and it has been a wonderful help. It has been a great gift you have given. And so he's also helped establish a philosophy and faith journal. He was the president of the American Philosophical Association, Central Division, I have to add that right? Okay. And a founding member and organizer of the Society of Christian Philosophers. He has lectured at the Free University in Amsterdam, at Oxford, at St. Andrews, at Princeton, Yale, Virginia, many other places, and even here in 1977 when he was a little younger. Through his teaching and many books, he has been a persuasive thinker and guide to many, myself included. And so it is my great privilege to welcome him here that he may lead us in reflections on justice and charity.
Thank you for inviting me to give this Geneva lecture. It is, I think, the third time I've been to University of Illinois. Iowa. Possibly the fourth time. This is going to be an old-fashioned talking head performance. For those of you who are under 30, you've never seen this, so this is how it used to be. For the others, it's a trip into nostalgia. Why are charity and benevolence not enough? Parenthetically, I'm going to use the terms charity and benevolence on this occasion interchangeably. Why does justice matter? Why isn't it sufficient to think and act in terms of charity and benevolence? What does thinking and talking in terms of justice add? Why have justice organizations, in addition to charity projects, relief organizations, and development organizations? For example, why have International Justice Mission in addition to World Vision? Jesus said that we are to love God above all and our neighbors as ourselves. Isn't that enough? He never said, seek justice. So why bring justice into the picture? Those are the questions that I invite you to think about along with me this afternoon. Before we set out, I've got to identify the form of justice that I'm going to be talking about. It's my impression that most Americans, when they hear the term justice, think immediately of punishment, of meting out punishment. They think of prisons. A pretty good rule of thumb is if you hear a politician talking about justice, they've got prisons in mind. My understanding is that this past fall you co-sponsored here at the University of Iowa Brian Stevenson. Stevenson works in the field of criminal justice. His book, Just Mercy, is a wonderfully moving book. And I've heard him talk, and if he talked the way I've heard him talk, the same way here, it was a very moving talk, right? I'm not going to be talking about criminal justice. I mean, that's hugely important, but it's not what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. I'm going to be talking about what I and others call first-order justice or primary justice. The idea is this. It's when there's been a violation of first-order justice that criminal justice becomes relevant. Or more generally than just criminal justice, second-order justice. It's when there's been a violation of first-order justice that things like punishment, reprimands, scoldings, reparations, and so forth become relevant. First-order justice pertains to how teachers and students interact, how merchandisers interact with clients, how the receptionist in the doctor's office interacts with the people who come in for their appointments, and so forth. If the receptionist violates first-order justice by insulting a patient, then second-order justice in the form of a reprimand becomes relevant. Parenthetically, I happen to use this example because a receptionist in the Yale Health Clinic did insult me. Whether she ever got reprimanded, I don't know. So when I ask, why isn't charity enough? What does justice contribute? Why does it matter? It's first-order justice that I've got in mind, not that criminal justice, second-order, and so forth justice. If I'm a teacher, here's an example. If I'm a teacher, why isn't it enough that I think in terms of being good and kind and helpful to the students? Why is it important that I also think in terms of treating the students justly? What does that add? Why is it important? So let me begin by describing the episode in which I first became vividly aware, I may have been aware of it before, I don't know, but in which I first became vividly aware that justice matters, or at least one reason why it matters. I've written about the episode. I would guess that some of you have read what I've written, but I would also guess that most of you have not. So here goes. It happened back in September 1975. I was sent by the college at which I was teaching philosophy, Calvin College, to a conference at the University of Potchefstroom in South Africa. Potchefstroom is a medium-sized city. My guess is about the same as Iowa City, located in the center of the country, roughly in the center of the country, maybe an hour and a half drive from Johannesburg, the capital. It was in those days very much an Afrikaner, a white Afrikaner university. Black students, I'm going to have to describe it, I'm going to have to use the old South African classification. Sorry about that. Whites, blacks, coloreds. So think of it like this: so-called whites, so-called blacks, so-called coloreds, okay? So-called blacks and coloreds were allowed on campus. Students were allowed on campus only in the evening. During the day, of course, there were so-called blacks and coloreds who were serving students in the cafeteria and cleaning their rooms and so forth. The topic of the conference was Christian higher education, or more specifically, Reformed Presbyterian Christian education, higher education around the world. There were Afrikaners present at the conference. There were some English South Africans present. There were so-called black and colored scholars from South Africa present. There were some other people present from Africa, a few of us from North America, and a few from Asia. The conference was not about apartheid. It was about Christian higher education. But the main topic of conversation in all the coffee breaks, all the lunch breaks, all the dinner breaks was apartheid. Recall, I trust you remember you know what apartheid was, right? Yeah? This was 1975, well before the revolution and the overthrow of the apartheid regime. So over and over, it was a topic of conversation in coffee breaks and so forth. Now, there was a large contingent of Dutchmen. Afrikaans and Dutch, the Afrikaans language is derivative from the Dutch. They probably wouldn't like me saying it quite like that, but historically that's how it is. And they're still closely enough related so that they can converse with they can understand each other when they're speaking their own languages. The Dutch were very well informed about apartheid and about what was going on in South Africa generally, and they were very angry about apartheid. So they not only raised the issue in the coffee breaks and the lunch breaks and so forth, but they exploited every opportunity they could think of in the question periods after the talks to raise the issue. Professor Vanderheid, I found your last point very interesting, and I wondered how that related to the system of apartheid in South Africa. That's how it would go. Finally, the organizers of the conference were fed up with this, turning everything into apartheid. So they agreed to have a late night, 10 o'clock evening session devoted entirely to apartheid. It was the most intense meeting I had ever attended, and I think it remains the most intense meeting I have ever attended. The Dutch vented their anger at the Afrikaners. I learned later that the Afrikaners, under criticism, usually said, "But you don't understand." They couldn't say that to the Dutch. The Dutch understood very well. So what they said instead, what the Afrikaners said instead was, "Why are you so judgmental?" The Afrikaners would go back into their critique of apartheid. "But you're so judgmental." Back and forth. After about an hour, neither party had anything new to say to the other. They hadn't had anything new to say to each other for 35 minutes, but they kept on talking. And it was then that the so-called blacks and coloreds from South Africa began to speak up. More in tones, I thought, but I'd want them to say whether I was right about this, more in tones of hurt than of anger. They spoke of the indignities daily heaped upon them by the whole system of apartheid. And they spoke of the indignities in personal interactions with white people, both English and Afrikaners. And then they issued a powerful call for justice. The response of the Afrikaners who defended apartheid, not all of them did, most of them did, the response of the Afrikaners to this cry for justice took me completely aback. They did not contest the claim of the so-called blacks and colors that they were being treated unjustly. Instead, they said that justice was not the issue. Benevolence was the issue. We Afrikaners, they said, are a very generous, benevolent people. They told stories about how well-to-do Afrikaners who had black servants living in their backyard, how they would give them clothes that their own children had outgrown, trinkets at Christmas time, and so forth. And then they said that the whole system of apartheid is fundamentally a benevolent ideal. You see, they said, there are some 10 or 11 different nationalities in South Africa, depending a little bit about how you count a nation, of course, 10 or 11. And it was their vision that these distinct nations or nationalities should each flourish in its own way, develop its own literature, its own style of basket weaving, its own style of rug weaving, its own practices of farming, and so forth. Separate development, they called it. But if separate development is going to be achieved, you can't have all these people just mix through each other. They've got to be apart, right? Hence, apartheid. Now, it's true, they added, there's been some suffering, and we don't wish to discount that. But there's a great good to be achieved, which will outweigh the temporary suffering. And they went on to say, speaking to the so-called blacks and coloreds and to the Dutch, and all you ever do is criticize us. You never acknowledge our generosity. You never take account of our benevolence. All you ever do is criticize us. I remember one South African, I'm going to use her name, you don't know who she was, Elaine, on the platform, tears running down her eyes, saying, but why can't we just love each other? Why do you always criticize us? Why can't we just love each other? What I saw more clearly than ever before was benevolence being used as an instrument of oppression. Self-perceived benevolence, of course. And I learned then and there that one reason why justice matters is that justice puts a brake, B-R-A-K-E, justice puts a brake on oppressive paternalistic benevolence. There's a lot of oppressive paternalistic benevolence in our world, both on the part of individuals and on the part of regimes, the communist regimes, the Nazi regimes, and so forth. Justice, one thing that justice does, it puts a brake on such benevolence. How and why does it do that? That's the question that I'd like to explore with you for a while now. What is it about, what is justice, and what is it about justice that says, no way, no matter how much good you may think you are achieving, no way. So now, a few minutes on justice. In the Western tradition, there are basically two ways of thinking, and remember, it's first-order justice. In the Western tradition, there are basically two ways of thinking about first-order justice. One that comes from the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, and one that comes from the ancient Roman jurist Ulpian, U-L-P-I-A-N. Aristotle's view was that justice consists of the fair or equitable distribution of benefits and burdens. I prefer Ulpian's way of thinking. I'm not going to get into why I prefer it this afternoon, unless you really want to get me to talk about it in the question period afterwards. I prefer Ulpian's way of thinking. Here's what Ulpian said. Here's his famous formula that enters into the Western tradition by way of Constantinople. Justice, said Ulpian, consists of rendering to each person what is his or her right or due. For those of you who still know Latin, the Latin word is jus, J-U-S. Justice consists of rendering to each person what is due them, what they have a right to, what is theirs by right. Now, by itself, that doesn't tell you very much, right? Because now we got to talk about, and what is having a right to something? What is it that we've got rights to? So that next. Parenthetically, it's my guess that some of you here are feeling a little bit uneasy at this point. It's almost certain that some people in this audience don't like talk about rights. It makes them feel uneasy. I think I can explain why that is, but I'm not going to, unless once again you ask me in the question period afterwards, I'm not going to try to undo that uneasiness. I think that once I've explained what I take a right to be, you won't feel as uneasy as you did before. I have a brother-in-law who worked for CDC down in Atlanta. I get off the plane in Atlanta. His name is Stuart. Stuart says, "We got to talk." And I know exactly what he wants to talk about, rights. Stuart is against the idea of rights. And it was his experience in communicable disease work in foreign countries that led him to be suspicious of rights. He thought it was a way of trying to make people feel guilty for not having gotten rid of river blindness, for example. Okay, here's what I take a right to be. I think a right is always to the good of being treated in a certain way by somebody. The two components there, being treated by somebody. A good has always got to do with being treated by somebody some way, and to the good of being treated a certain way. Start with the being treated by somebody. For example, you have a right with respect to me, that I not insult you. So rights, think of it like this, rights are a certain kind of social relationship. Ways of being treated. They have sociality built into them. I know a lot of people think that rights talk is highly individualistic, but I think when you actually look, or at least as I think of it, they've got, as I say, sociality built into them. There are ways of being treated, and that's social, right? They have to do with how we treat each other. That's one idea. And the other idea is they're always to the good of being treated a certain way by somebody. I don't have a right to your breaking my leg, unless some peculiar circumstance. The only way you can save my life is by breaking my leg. I've been pinned under, earthquake has come around, I've been pinned under a building, and the only way you can save my life is maybe, well, not just breaking my leg, but cutting it off. But that's exceptional. We don't have a right to having our legs cut off. So let me say it again. Rights are to the good, some good way of being treated by somebody. They're social, and they are rights to a good. Okay so far? But though a right is always to the good of being treated a certain way, there are many good ways of being treated that we don't have a right to. The right is always to the good of being treated a certain way, but the converse does not hold. There are lots of good ways of being treated that you and I don't have a right to. A somewhat whimsical example. In the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, there's a glorious Rembrandt, well, there are many glorious Rembrandt paintings, but I think the greatest of them all is not the famous Night Watch, but, which is really good, but the so-called Jewish Bride. Stupendously beautiful painting. I think it would be a great good in my life if the Rijksmuseum would donate to me Rembrandt's The Jewish Bride to hang on my living room wall, along with a substantial security staff to stand guard. That would be really good. It'd be a much greater good than that receptionist not treating me better than she did. I mean, that's a good, but it's a minor good comparison. But I don't have a right to the Rijksmuseum giving me that painting. They haven't wronged me. It's not a case of injustice. It's just a case of regret. And of course, I don't dwell on it all that much, but the flowering trees in Iowa City are beautiful, but are giving me a bit of trouble. So the great challenge facing anybody who develops a theory of rights is what makes some good ways of being treated by our fellows things to which we have things to which we have a right, whereas other good ways of being treated would be really nice, but you can't claim that you've got a right to it, that you're being wronged. That's the challenge. How do you sort out the good cases that amount to rights claims and the good cases that don't constitute rights claims? Well, anybody who knows anything about philosophy can anticipate in advance that philosophers have different views on these matters. I'm not going to give you a course this afternoon on those different views. I'll just give you my own view. I think that to explain the difference, you see the difference, the good ways of being treated to which we do have a right and the good ways of being treated to which we don't have a right, which would just be nice. I think to explain the difference, we have to introduce two fundamental facts about us human beings. Two really fundamental facts. The first is this. We human beings have worth, dignity, goodness. We are one and all praiseworthy in certain ways. Distinguish us from our lives. Our lives can also go better and worse. How are things going, I say to you? And if you come from Minnesota as I did, you say, been worse. Even though you're supernally happy at the moment, been worse. So we can evaluate the quality of our lives. But also, here's my proposal. We human beings are also, not just our lives, but we praise each other. Though I've been retired for 15 years, I still, to my surprise, am asked to write recommendations for former students and colleagues and so forth. And when I write a recommendation, I reflect on what about this person is praiseworthy. I don't talk about how their life has been going. Usually admissions committees aren't interested in that. But I talk about their praiseworthiness. I single out what's praiseworthy. And on occasion, I make some mention of what's not so praiseworthy about the person, but I highlight the praiseworthiness. Okay. We're praiseworthy in various respects. But it's my view that we are also, each and every one of us, praiseworthy on account of bearing the image of God. That's not an accomplishment on our part, and it's not something you can get rid of. The most dastardly terrorist cannot get rid of this praiseworthy feature of him or her, that he or she bears the image of God. Ineradicable. So, we are praiseworthy in various respects. Accomplishments, this inherent praiseworthiness, sometimes the relationships that we stand in, and so forth. Second feature of human beings, that's the first feature. The second feature of human beings is this. We can treat our fellows in ways that befit their worth or in ways that do not befit their worth, in ways that disvalue them, demean them, play down their worth, treat them with disrespect. If you're a student in a philosophy course that I'm teaching, and you've done top-notch work, then you've acquired the worth of, obviously, having done top-notch work. And in the American grading system, what befits your worth is my giving you an A. If I gave you a C instead, I would be treating you with, what word do you want? Disrespect, devaluing, demeaning, and so forth. So we human beings have worth, praiseworthiness of various kinds, and we can treat each other in ways that befit that worth, or in ways that don't befit that worth. Using those two basic ideas, I can now explain how I understand rights. It's my view that you have a right, it wouldn't just be nice, but you've got a right to the good of my treating you a certain way, just in case if I didn't treat you that way, I wouldn't be treating you as befits your worth. That's a philosopher sort of way of putting it, but let me put it again and then put it more simply. You've got a right to the good of my treating you a certain way, just in case if I didn't treat you that way, I wouldn't be treating you as befits your worth. I would instead be demeaning you, belittling you, whatever. You could put it like this. Rights are what respect for worth requires. Rights are what respect for worth requires. If you've done top-notch work in my course, then the worth that you've acquired by virtue of that means that you now have a right to an A from me. Correct? If I didn't give you an A, I would not be treating you as befits your worth, your praiseworthiness. So let me say it again. Rights are what respect for worth requires. Okay, that was rights. And justice, I agree with Alpian, justice is connected with treating people in a way that honors their rights, their due, what's due them. So now our big question. Why does justice matter? What difference does it make if we think, speak in terms of justice? Given the connection between justice and rights, that amounts to this. Why do rights matter? What would be lost if we never thought and talked in terms of rights? Rights talk can be abused, no doubt about it. My brother-in-law thought it was seriously abused in the international health organizations, and he may have been right about that. I don't know. Can be abused. But I say to Stuart, hey, look, I think something really important would be lost if we just tossed it out on account of the abuses. Let's fight against the abuses. In general, moral vocabulary is abused. I think probably the most abused word in our moral vocabulary is the word love. It's really abused. But that's not an argument for saying let's never talk about it again. It's an argument for doing what you can to reform ways in which people talk about love and so about rights. So what would be lost? I think three things of great importance would be lost. Let me try to explain what they are. It's not so easy to explain, but I'll do my best. Let me start with the most difficult while you're still fresh. Recall my declaration when I was explaining what a right is, that a right is to the good of being treated a certain way, to the good of being treated a certain way. And now notice that I was using the passive voice, was treated a certain way. A right is to the good of being treated a certain way, being treated. So in thinking about charity, benevolence, and justice and the difference, I've been led to think that the moral order has two fundamental dimensions. They're interconnected, but they're distinct. I'd never thought of this before I thought about love and benevolence and justice. Two dimensions. Let me call them the agent dimension and the patient dimension in the old sense of the English word, receiver. Agent dimension, patient dimension. Call them the actor dimension and the recipient dimension. On the one hand, there is the moral significance of what one does. That's the agent dimension, actor dimension. On the other hand, there is the moral significance of how one is done unto. How one is done unto. That's the patient or recipient dimension. Two fundamental dimensions, interlocking, of course, but distinct. And here's how I now see it. The language of rights and its companion language of being wronged when you don't receive what you've got a right to, the language of rights and its companion language of being wronged enables us to bring to speech the recipient dimension of the moral order, enables us to bring to speech the significance of how we are being treated. Consider an abused spouse. And suppose that the only language available to her is agent language. Language of love, benevolence, charity, duty, responsibility, all, I'm loving you, I'm responsible, I'm doing my obligation, the language of the agent dimension. With such language, the abused spouse can call to attention the moral condition of her abuser, right? He is acting unlovingly. He is guilty of not doing his duty. He is not acting responsibly. That's all got to do with his moral character, right? What the language of rights enables her to do is to call attention to her moral condition. She is wronged. She is being wronged, treated unjustly. Without that language, if she's only got agent language available, she can talk about, let me say it again, the moral condition of her spouse, but not about her moral condition. And so it is, I submit, that the social justice movements of the last century or more have all used the language of rights. They've called attention to, the protesters have called attention to their condition, right? To the condition of the oppressors too, but think of it. Women's rights, children's rights, civil rights, gay rights, down the list it goes. And I think the reason is, don't you, that this enables them to call attention to their moral condition. They're being wronged, abused, and so forth. Let's get at the same two-dimension idea, not leave it yet, but from a different angle. Suppose that you are reflecting not on how you've been done unto, reflecting on how you've been done unto, and using the recipient language of rights to describe it. But suppose you're reflecting now on how you should treat some other party. So here's the question. What's the difference between thinking of the situation only in terms of the agent dimension, me, what I'm doing, and thinking of the situation also in terms of the recipient dimension, you? What's the difference between thinking of the situation only in terms of my duties and responsibilities and goodness and benevolence and all that, and thinking of it also in terms of your rights? Let me apply the question to myself. When I enter a classroom, what's the difference between thinking of the situation wholly in terms of my duties and my generosity, my goodness, my care about the students? What's the difference between that and thinking of it also in terms of the rights of those others, the students? Now, I've got the feeling, I don't know about you, I've got the feeling that this is a profoundly different orientation, thinking of it wholly in terms of me, what I'm doing and what I should be doing and all that, and thinking of it in terms of your claims on me. It feels profoundly different, but I find it hard to put the difference into words. Maybe you can help. Let me try, though. I think that second orientation requires that I be open to your worth and to the claims that that puts on me in a way that the first orientation does not. I think that the second orientation requires a sort of decentering of myself, putting myself in your shoes and not just always in my shoes, and asking what claims do you make on me and not just what good things am I doing to you. I think what happens is that here's the metaphor that comes to mind. I am no longer in moral control of the situation. I have become a moral listener as opposed to a moral agent and talker. And you know, when you're a listener, you're not always sure what's going to happen, what's going to be said. Whereas when you're a talker, well, you can be pretty sure as to what you're going to say. So I think it's a fascinating, difficult to describe decentering so that you become my center. To apply it to where I began. The problem with the Afrikaners was that they were so full of their own self-perceived goodness and their own self-perceived virtue and their own self-perceived benevolence that they never opened themselves up. They really never opened themselves up to recognizing the worth of the so-called blacks and coloreds. never opened themselves up to the question of whether they were demeaning them, only thinking about how good we are to you. They resisted moral decentering. They resisted becoming moral listeners. Even at that conference, they didn't want to listen. They didn't say, I see what you mean, but instead they said, think of how benevolent we are. And of course, they insisted that the so-called blacks and coloreds be on good behavior, or their generosity would not be forthcoming. That's how it is with charity and benevolence, right? Charity and benevolence can be selective. You can't be charitable to everybody. Charity and benevolence can be selective. And it can be conditioned on good behavior. Let's face it, what the Israelis have been saying to the Palestinians for more than 50 years is, if you are on good behavior, we will consider negotiations. Otherwise, we won't. Of course, the irony is that when they are on good behavior, what's the point of negotiations? So charity and benevolence can be selective, and they can be conditioned. I cannot select whom I will treat justly. I have to treat everybody justly. Everybody, nobody unjustly. And I cannot attach conditions to my treating you justly. I cannot say, I'll treat you justly, give you your rights if you behave. So that's my first reason for thinking that rights and justice are important. It brings the patient dimension of the moral order into the picture, the dimension of how we are done unto. Now for a second reason. Second reason why I think the recognition of rights and justice is important has to do with a feature of rights that I haven't called attention to yet. In the literature on rights, it's called the trumping force of rights, or the peremptory force of rights. Here's what's meant. If you've got a right, the right to the good of my treating you a certain way, then no matter how many good things I could bring about in the world by not treating you that way, I must treat you that way. I ought to treat you that way if you've got a right to treat that way, no matter how many good things I could do to these other people sitting in the front row here. Suppose you're, once again, a student in a course of mine who's done top-notch work. You've got a right to an A. But suppose that I find you rather cocky, rather full of yourself. I think that some character reformation would be a good thing. And I think that giving you a C might just achieve some of that character reformation, jolt you. And let me just add that once you've taught for a long time, as I did, you can find flaws in even the finest student paper. So you can make the C sound not implausible. Whether implausible, I don't know about that, but not implausible, so you give them a C. You highlight the flaws. You don't mention the virtues. To do that would be to wrong you. Parenthetically, I give you this example because a colleague of mine once told me that that's exactly what he had done. He had given a brilliant student a C because he thought the student was too cocky. I thought and think that that was outrageous. If my student needs some character reformation, I'm going to have to find some other way than wronging him by giving him a C. That's a tiny little, but if you're the person involved, poignant example of the point. Here's the big point. The 20th century was filled with communist, Nazi, and so forth regimes, and Afrikaner regimes, that believed it was acceptable to treat human beings like animals or worse, if doing so would achieve some great good. If we cannot appeal to the rights of people, if we cannot argue that treating human beings in this way is to wrong them and is hence off the table, if we can't do that, then we've got no way to stop this calculus of goods way of thinking. No way to stop this utilitarian way of thinking. Let's grant for the sake of the argument that this separate development society that the Afrikaners envisioned would be a good thing. Let's grant for the sake of the argument. I doubt it, but the massive injustice heaped on the so-called blacks and coloreds meant that achieving that ideal by way of apartheid was impermissible. The benevolent impulses of the Afrikaners, let's grant that they had some, did not excuse the injustice. The injustice trumped the benevolence. So I go back to what I said earlier. Rights, justice, are a brake, B-R-A-K-E, are a brake on oppressive, paternalistic benevolence. And now I close with a third thing that, as I see it, thinking and acting in terms of justice and rights brings into the picture something that justice and benevolence don't. I'm sure you've noticed that benevolence and charity seldom stir up hostility and anger. Almost nobody is against soup kitchens. Relief projects seldom stir up hostility and anger. Almost nobody is against relief to the victims of earthquakes in Haiti and Ecuador. Well-conceived development projects almost never stir up hostility and anger. Almost nobody is against well-conceived benevolence projects in Sierra Leone. Not so for justice organizations. Almost always they stir up hostility and anger. Justice work is usually dangerous work. There's a wonderful justice organization in Honduras, Association for a More Just Society, which is really a justice organization, not a relief or development organization. 7 years ago, their head lawyer, Dionisio, was shot on a street in Tegucigalpa at point-blank range. Turned out was shot by the police. You have maybe read about the scandal in the police in Honduras that was uncovered 2 weeks ago. A video was obtained from about 9 years ago in which 21 police officers were recorded, video recorded, plotting the assassination of the head of the narcotics division. And they did assassinate him, assassinated an underling as well. The head of police was aware of the monitor in the room where they were meeting, so he pulled the monitor out, but he wasn't aware of the fact that the camera kept recording. So a newspaper in Honduras and the New York Times recently got a hold of this video. So the president of the country has vowed to purge the police. He's appointed a 3-person investigation committee. 2 of the people on that committee turn out to be from the organization I just mentioned, a Christian organization, Association for a More Just Society. They now ride around in armored cars, those 2, and have round-the-clock bodyguards. Justice work is dangerous. Same was true of the work of International Justice Mission. Why is it dangerous? Well, if you seek not just to improve people's lives, but to see to it that they are treated justly, then you won't only see to it that you treat them justly, but you'll also do what you can to see to it that others will treat them justly. And if their plight is caused not by some natural calamity like an earthquake, but by their being victims of injustice, then you're going to naturally do what you can to try to stop the perpetrators from doing what they're doing, to try to stop the Honduran police from being in cahoots with drug lords. And almost always the people who are perpetrating injustice don't want to stop. Imagine that. They don't want to stop doing what they're doing. They're benefiting from it. So no problem if you send care packages to the victims of apartheid. But it was dangerous work to try to stop apartheid. The work of the International Justice Mission and of the Association for a More Just Society in Honduras is dangerous work because it's justice work. A fair rule of thumb is if what you're doing stirs up hostility and anger, fair rule of thumb is it's justice work that you're engaged in, not relief work. That's it. Those are my reasons for thinking that acting in terms of charity and benevolence is not enough, that we must also think and act in terms of justice. Don't get me wrong. Charity and benevolence are often called for. In fact, they're always called for in some place or other. So don't get me wrong. But I've really come to think, as a result of mainly of experiences, that they're not enough, that justice is necessary.
You're right there, too. Lori, right there.
Maybe I misunderstood you, but it seemed at one point you might have contrasted justice and utilitarianism or something like that. Could you speak a little more about how you see utilitarianism and justice being somehow opposed?
So utilitarianism is the ethical view that, roughly speaking, or here's one way of putting it, seek the greatest good of the greatest number. It thinks in terms of well-being, flourishing, thinks in terms of how your life is going. And then that's the basic category. And then it says seek the greatest well-being of the greatest number. And utilitarians, it's widely recognized that utilitarians have difficulty with accounting for justice. It appears on the surface that it's just not there. And Jeremy Bentham, one of the founders of modern utilitarianism, said that natural rights was folly that walks on sticks, as I recall. He said, pure folly. So my view is that to account for justice and rights, we have to introduce this second factor, not just how your life is going, but how the worth of us ourselves, of us human beings. So not just the utilitarian category of how your life is going, flourishing, well-being, and so forth, but the praiseworthiness of the agents, of the people who have the lives. And it seems to me that the Afrikaners were thinking purely in utilitarian terms, achieving some great good. And there was the other category of, but what are you, you're demeaning these people, you're treating them with profound disrespect. They didn't want to think about that, so it was a utilitarian calculus. The same, it seems to me, was true of Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot in Cambodia and so forth. They were thinking purely in terms of this visionary good to be achieved and not the indignities that were heaped upon the actual human beings.
Over here. Yeah.
Can you just make sure you speak into the mic when you respond? We're just having trouble hearing you.
What was that?
A little closer.
Sorry.
Dr. Wolterstorff, you spoke to how charity done inappropriately can devalue those the charity is given to and demean them. And yet, in your speaking about rights and the receivership in how it deals with justice, how do we guard against doing the same thing in our speaking of rights? Because much of what is spoken about today displays a culture of offense and outrage that makes us lacking in our agency, I think, with regard to justice. Does that question make sense?
I'll answer maybe part of it, and then you can highlight the part that I didn't answer. So one can think, so what I've emphasized is my coming into a room like this or a classroom situation and the rights of the people in front of me. If one is part of a highly individualistic, and not just individualistic, but self-oriented culture, one is going to emphasize one's own rights. I think that's a profound, and let's face it, there are a lot of people who couldn't care less about other people's rights, but they're always harping on their own rights. That, it seems to me, is just a profound distortion of the very idea of rights. Because whether or not you're recognizing it, these people come into your, here's how I think of it. You all come into my presence bearing certain claims on how I treat you. I come into your presence bearing certain claims on how you treat me, sure. But it's not just all meism. Now, Ian, it seems to me that I haven't talked about the struggle to undo injustice, the struggle to correct wrongdoing. But I think in that struggle, anger plays an important, properly controlled anger. Anger plays an important role. What struck me about the South African resistance movement, for example, is there holding alive, remember an episode in which some 50 so-called blacks and colors were shot at point-blank range. Remember, what was it? Remember Sharpeville. Remember Sharpeville. And it appeared to me that the function of that was to keep alive the cry, this must not be, this must not happen again. And that's the cry of anger. So anger has an appropriate role. I think we should be angry to a greater or lesser degree at wronging. We should be angry. The people on Honduras should be profoundly angry at the police conniving to assassinate the head of the Narcotics Bureau. But you maybe had something more in mind.
I think that reveals, I guess, part of my concern is that in victimhood, in that receivership-only perspective, which I'm not saying you're saying that, but often seems to be the outworking of this rights language. And what you speak into language is, I mean, it seems to speak against much of at least what Scripture, if we're coming from a scriptural perspective, says about the way justice goes. That James 1 says, you know, the anger of man does not accomplish the righteousness which God requires, and vengeance is mine, says the Lord, elsewhere. So that speaks to, I guess, how do we acknowledge our receipt of injustice and work for it from our own distorted perspective on what justice is, because we're finite and our image and perspective is distorted by sin.
Yeah. Well, when I read the Old Testament prophets, Isaiah, Micah, Amos, Ezekiel, they were angry. I mean, the anger sort of oozes off the pages, doesn't it? And they use extremely harsh language. You're acting like bulls and so forth. So, victimhood. Victimhood is a complicated idea, I think. The people, the so-called blacks and coloreds in South Africa were victims. They were undeniably victims, and they called attention to their victimhood. So it's my impression, Ian, that's what's happening in this country is often a way of defending oneself against the charge of injustice is to say, you're just playing victim. But often the person who's just playing victim is a victim. But just playing victim is a way of trying to silence them. So I think we got to sort through when just playing victim is being used as a silencing tool and when there really is something sick about it. I mean, sometimes there's something sick about it. No doubt sometimes people play victim when they're not really. Fair enough. I think that happens much less often than they really are victim.
So another hand here.
I was going to ask, kind of in relation to more local, everyday injustices. You said, I wrote down a quote, just that the perpetrators of injustice don't want to stop perpetrating because they're benefiting from it, which is an accepted fact of that. What about Christians when we are in the perpetrating party? So with racism, most of the people in here would be in the perpetrating party of that, but we're believers, and so how does the redemption of the gospel make us want to stop perpetrating? Or like you could apply it to like everyday racism, everyday sexism, things like that.
Don't quite get it yet, so
Oh.
put it in slightly different words.
Sorry? Okay, you want me to repeat the question?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, now I'm nervous. So you had a quote saying that the perpetrators of injustice don't want to stop perpetrating because they're benefiting from that. And I was saying that while we're not in like a very obvious world crisis here in Iowa City, there's daily injustice, and a lot of us sitting in this room are on the perpetrating side of that injustice, and many are believers. And so how do we not be those perpetrators who don't want to stop perpetrating because we're benefiting from it? How does Jesus address that?
Really good point. You caught one of the points that was underneath my talk without my bringing it out. So it'd be tempting in a talk like this to talk about human rights, to immediately go to the great big things. And that's important, but what I emphasized is what I sometimes call the fine texture. I want to start with the fine texture of justice and rights, treating each other justly and ordinary, and then I gave some teacher-student, merchandiser-client, receptionist in the Yale Health Clinic, and me as the as a patient and so forth. So I start with the fine texture, and in that fine texture, we wrong each other. And so your question is, how do we correct that? By reprimanding each other, calling it to the other person. Sometimes the person didn't even notice it. Let's be honest. So calling it to their attention. My calling to the attention of a colleague so let's go back to the colleague who gave that bright student a C because he thought the student was cocky and could stand some character reformation. I said, Joe, I think that's wrong. So we had a discussion. And I think I persuaded him. So it's in the fine texture, we talk with each other, we reprimand each other, we encourage each other. Sometimes we call attention to the injustices that we or the other person had not even noticed, and so forth. But I'm glad you caught the idea that we start with the fine texture, and then we'll get to the great big things about no torture and so forth. I take it that torture is not a big issue in Iowa City, you know? I'm wrong?
Great. Thank you, Professor Wolterstorff. It's wonderful to hear you speak again. I'm wondering about how much social and community consensus is necessary to have a workable life that involves and includes reference to rights the way you describe them, especially given that your position is premised on something as fundamental as the image of God as a scriptural foundation for where this worthiness and praiseworthiness comes from to begin with. And where I'm going with this contextually these days would be, say, the question of physician-assisted suicide. So that now we have in Canada a Canadian Supreme Court that votes 9-0 that there is a right to assistance in dying, etc., whereas currently our Supreme Court, the only time it addressed things in 1997, said 9-0 in opposition to such a right. So to what extent, when you get now to the margins of these questions where there are controversies, what can you tell us more about the position you'd recommend for us in light of those controversies?
So when it comes to rights of all levels, from the humble ones to the great big ones, when it comes to discussions about rights, as when it comes to the discussion about obligations, we've got disagreements. We don't disagree about everything, and when I was teaching and there would be discussions in class and students would say, "Oh, it's so difficult." Really, it's up to everybody's own view as to what's right and wrong and so forth. I would at a certain point say, really? Suppose you were a Jew in Nazi Germany? would you say what you just said? Would you say, well, you know, Hitler's got his view about how Jews should be treated, and I've got different views, but he's got a right to his view. So it's partly that we major in the gray cases. And I think it's important to start out from the clear cases. But we do get to the gray cases, of course, and you're right about that. And then I think we do our best to make our case with examples as vivid as possible. And my view is that we in the West are trading on an inherited Christian culture, Christian Jewish culture, Muslim culture, which is wearing thin. I think the rights of those human beings who are on the margins, who are in permanent comas and suffering from Alzheimer's and severely impaired from birth and so forth, I see no way of arguing for their rights other than appealing to the image of God in them also, and not just in the well-functioning people like the people, human beings like the people in this auditorium. So I think that insofar as people in the United States agree with me and you on those issues, we are living on here's what Richard Rorty, secular philosopher, said: we are living on borrowed capital, and what he meant was borrowed Christian capital. And so Rorty was very honest about that. So when it gets to the issue of assisted suicide and so forth, we do our best to argue the case. In a democracy, you have to live with losing the argument sometimes. But we do in moral situations generally, as with obligation, responsibility, all of them, don't start from the gray cases is my advice. Start from the clear cases and then argue as eloquently as you can.
Dr. Wolterstorff, I'd like to speak to the issue of courage in the midst of this difficulty. And the picture that I have in mind is Mary washing Jesus' feet. Here is a woman who was rejected in her society. She enters the house of the opposition, if I may put it that way, who have been putting her down for years. And she washes the feet of her hero, Jesus. And the only way that I can picture that is to use the word, the assertion of humility. The assertion of humility as a courageous act. Could you speak to that?
So, right. And bravery, an indispensable part of all movements to undo injustice is bravery. International justice mission people are brave. The people in Honduras are brave. Mary. So Jesus, as you know, as the Gospels tell us, acquired the reputation of having no preferences, of being totally equitable in how he treated people, no preferentiality. I read the story about the coin, the Roman coin, as it's set in that context, actually. Different people read it differently about the separation of church and state and so forth. I read Jesus' interlocutors at that point as saying, and how far are you willing to take this no preference, no reverence issue? Are you willing to take it all the way to the emperor and he's got no more? And in fact, Jesus says, yeah. So Mary knows about his reputation and comes in and knows that Jesus shows no preferentiality, that he will not toss her out, even though the Pharisees might have wanted to do so. And she gives a vivid example of exactly that, and Jesus doesn't. Jesus accepts her. So you're right, an assertion of, a humble expression of the fact that she had heard Jesus, that she had heard what she was saying, and that she too, whatever her prior reputation, was accepted, and that Jesus was willing to have meals with her as well. Yeah.
I just had a quick question because, well, over here. Sorry. Not much different. Because you were expressing an interest in sort of clarifying language sometimes earlier in your lecture, and I was thinking of, in rights language, a lot of time people talk of equal rights and that equality is a moral imperative of its own. But I've heard arguments that believe that arguing on behalf of equality as a moral imperative can actually diminish sort of the actual benefits that one would get out of true equality. And based on what you're talking about with rights, it seemed much more individualistic. Part of the argument that I've heard is that equality is relativistic. And so it's about how we compare to each other. Whereas I was listening to you talk about rights, and it seemed much more focused on the individual themselves, not necessarily ourselves, but the person that we're treating in a particular way. And so I was just curious about your views on how equality kind of plays into that. Is equality a moral imperative, that sort of thing?
So it seems to me we've got to ask always equality or inequality with respect to what? With respect to my classroom, the students did unequal quality work, almost always, and they had unequal rights to top-notch grades. Some had a right to it, some did not have a right to it. So there was a certain kind of rights inequality in the classroom. My view is that in liberal democracy, a fundamental principle of liberal democracy is that everybody has a right to equal voice. Not a right to equal outcomes and so forth, but a right to equal voice. We don't honor that very well in our voting systems, but that seems to be the underlying principle. And then my fundamental principle is that everybody ineluctably carries this equal worth, being created in the image of God. That's a deep and fundamental kind of equality. So my view is we got to talk about equality with respect to what? With respect to grades, with respect to equal voice in society, in a democratic polity, yeah, and so forth.
One there, and then we carry down here.
Thanks for your talk. You began your talk talking about rights, and then halfway through you started talking about rights talk. You said that rights talk is useful, and I'm not prepared to dispute that. That seems right to me. But I'm curious about rights. What are rights ontologically, on your view? And what is the relationship to the duties to which they're correlative?
Well, my apothegm is a right is what respect for worth requires. A right is, well, it's the best way to put it briefly. So the ontology of it, or the metaphysics of it, is that we've got two interacting things here. One is a right to, in the first place, rights are social. They're with respect to people. They're not just right for me to treat you or for you to treat me. I don't just have well, there are limiting cases in which I've got rights with respect to myself of not abusing myself in certain ways, but that's the sort of limiting case. The normal thing is they're social, they're interactional, they're relational. And then a right is to the good of being treated a certain way by my fellows. And that, I think, involves, to explain that, requires introducing the notion of the praiseworthiness of persons in addition to good ways of treating them. I didn't get into the issue of the relation between rights and obligations, but I think there is a principle that I call a principle of correlatives here. If I have an obligation to you to treat you in a certain way, then you correspondingly have a right against me or toward me that I treat you in that way. So they are the flip side of each other. Let me say it again. If I've got an obligation to treat you in a certain way, then you have a right with respect to me that I treat you that way. So the flip side. So people often talk about, oh, vague rights talk is so difficult, discussions about rights, and assume that discussions about obligations are clear. And I say they just come together. Sometimes the better way to get a hang on it is to talk in terms of obligations. Sometimes the better way to get a hang on it is to talk in terms of rights. But if you answer the one question, you've answered the other. If we've agreed that I ought to treat you a certain way, then we've also come to agree that you've got a right to my treating you that way.
In the back here.
Hi, thank you for coming and making time to come out here. I was curious, I remember you defining justice as the minimum amount of love due your neighbor. Is that how you would put it? I think you put it in that language in the past.
I didn't say that.
You didn't say that?
No. Did I?
Oh. Okay.
It doesn't sound like me.
Oh, okay. I thought I saw like a short video that said, where you said something like that.
I hope not.
Okay. I was just going to ask about that.
Oh, it would be a good thing to ask about, yeah.
Yeah, because it reminds me of when people say it's the least I can do. Are they making a statement of justice where they ought to treat a person?
So here's maybe what I said that you picked up on. I don't know. Love will often go beyond justice, but it will never do less than justice. Love will do what justice requires, and sometimes it'll do a lot more than what justice requires, but it will do at least what justice requires. Now that's not quite, how do you think I put it? Justice is the least we can do to our neighbor?
Justice is the minimum amount of love due your neighbor, I think.
Yeah, no, I don't like that way of putting it.
Okay.
But I may have said words that could be interpreted that way.
One of the things I was interested in, I appreciate you coming to speak to us, but I wanted to know if you could talk about things that didn't fit the profile where an obligation and a right are counterparts to one another. These are the so-called positive rights, like a right to education or a right to medical care, where it's not clear who has the corresponding obligation to perform the duty. And then as a corollary to that, you also get into problems once you introduce those sorts of rights. So, that you can have conflicting rights, and this is where a lot of the rights problems with rights discourse comes in, is when you have the trumping effect with conflicting rights.
Yeah, so the example I gave was correlatives, was I picked out a specific person and said, if I have an obligation to you, then you have a right towards me. So we're getting deeper and deeper into the issues. Kant introduced the idea of imperfect duties. What he said is a little bit hazy, but I take what he said, what he was getting at, to be this. I can have an obligation to you to treat you in a certain way, but it may also be that I've got an obligation when walking the streets of Manhattan to distribute money to somebody or other. Not to any particular person, but to somebody or other. And if I haven't done it to distribute to any largesse to anybody, I failed in my obligation. But you can't point to any specific person and say that. I think we should introduce the same idea concerning rights, imperfect rights. I may have a right against somebody or other. I may have a right against you, or with respect to you, but I may have a right against somebody or other that they treat me in a certain way without there being any particular person that person is to treat me in that way. So a good many of the so-called positive rights, not by no means all of them, but a good many of them are imperfect rights. And that's why there's a range of candidates for what I want to say, for fulfilling the right.
One or two more?
You've mentioned that a person may have rights simply based on their status as an image of God, and that they may have rights based on individual characteristics or accomplishments. Is there such a thing as having rights based on membership in a particular group? Perhaps the group or members of that group have been wronged historically. Does that give members of that group going forward certain rights? It might be relevant to an issue like reparations, for example.
Yeah, I think that's true. Right, a historically wrong group has certain rights to reparations, and how is that right going to be exercised other than, well, I mean, maybe there's some head office for the group, but otherwise distributing the reparations to the members of the group. Yeah, so, yeah. Yep, so that's an interesting case of rights by virtue of membership in a group when the group has a certain corresponding right. Yep.
I will give the right of last question to the chairman of my board.
Well, I feel like your audience has given you quite a ringer of questions, and I'd like to turn it back and have you tell us a story. And that is, how does the actions of Desmond Tutu and the others in South Africa, when they come to power, how do you understand how they behaved? Were they acting with justice? Were they acting according to the rights of the Afrikaans who had oppressed them for generations? Were they acting out of benevolence? How are we to understand a movement like that, which in response to generations of oppression seeks reconciliation?
So I got to be a dear friend and remain a dear friend of one of the leaders of the resistance movement, Alan Boesak. Alan is not in South Africa now. He's teaching at a seminary in Indianapolis. He does not want to be, for the time being, in South Africa. He proved to be as fierce a critic of the ANC government, of the present ANC government, as he was of the Afrikaner government. And he is as much a persona non grata to the present ANC government as he was to the apartheid government. So Alan is profoundly disillusioned with how the ANC government has been handling its regime. Yes, blacks have votes in ways that they didn't have before, but it's Alan's view that the current government is corrupt and that a purely white elite has been replaced by a mixed black and white elite. And that in fundamental, I mean, there's not a system of apartheid anymore, so that's a gain, but it's disillusioning.
More to the point, there was no mass white bloodshed. They didn't slaughter.
True.
Right, when the ANC takes power, they're fallen people too.
Yep,
but
true.
What about that movement prevented what many people thought the Afrikaans deserved, which was to be treated the way they had treated others all those generations?
So I think two things at least were factors. One is that the resistant movement was consistently a nonviolence movement. Well, that's not quite true.
In terms of rights and benevolence, were they being treated according to their rights, or were they being treated out of benevolence?
Who?
The Afrikaans.
They were being treated as they had a right to be treated. Now, when we get into the issue of criminal justice, there was a lot of controversy there about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. My view about second-order justice is that I think what Jesus teaches, and Paul, is that punishment is permitted but not required. Forgiveness is permitted. And I think what the Truth and Reconciliation did was permitted. They granted a certain kind of amnesty to quite a few people instead of punishing them, even though they knew the perpetrators. I think that's what, I think if you admit the legitimacy of forgiveness to replace punishment, then I think you have to say, counter to all the ancient pagan philosophers, punishment is permitted, but it's not required in all situations. So the Afrikaners were treated justly. Thanks.
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.